Shalom Aleichem and welcome to Parsha Lomdus, Parshas Mראי. This week's Shiur has been generously sponsored by Reb Sholem Ber and Libby Klein and their family. May Hashem bless them with a lot of nachas from their children and with tremendous hatzlacha begashmius and beruchnius. We thank them very much for the sponsorship. Okay, let's get started. So in this week's Parsha, in the beginning, this is Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Gimel. So the Parsha is talking about that when the Yidden come to Eretz Yisrael, they should destroy the Avodah Zarah that they find there. So when itatztem es mizbachosam, you should smash their mizbachos, v'shibartem es matzivoisam, v'asheirayim tisr fun ba'esh. Pasuk is mayrich to describe how they should smash and destroy any Avodah Zarah which they find. And then in the next Pasuk, in Pasuk Dalid, it says, Lo sasun kein l'Hashem Elokeichem, that you should not do this to the Eibishter. You should not smash and destroy anything which belongs to the Eibishter. Avodah Zarah, yes, but things of hektish, things that belong to Hashem, Lo sasun kein. And from here we have a Lo saseh, a lav, that we're not allowed to destroy or break anything which is holy, anything which is hektish. So let's take a look at the Rambam in Hilchis Yesodei HaTorah, Perek Vav, Halacha Zayin. And the Rambam says there, Hasoiser afilu even achas derech hashchosa min hamizbeach, oy min ha'heichel, oy mishar ha'azara loike. If anybody demolishes even one stone in a way of destruction from the mizbeach or the heichel or from any other part of the azara, loike, they get malchus. Because it says by Avodah Zarah that you should smash their mizbachos. Uksiv lo sasun kein l'Hashem, and then it says lo sasun kein l'Hashem, as we just quoted from our Parsha. So lo sasun kein l'Hashem is a lo saseh against breaking or destroying or demolishing anything that's part of the Beis Hamikdash. And similarly, if a person burns wood that was hektish, derech hashchasa, they get malchus, shenemer v'asherayim tisrufun, that you should burn their asheros, but lo sasun kein l'Hashem. So this is the lo saseh, this is the lav that we see in the Rambam, that we're not allowed to break or destroy or smash anything which is hektish. Now, the Rambam repeats this halacha in Hilchas Beis Habchira, Perek Aleph, Halacha Yud Zayin. In that halacha, in Beis Habchira, Perek Aleph, Halacha Yud Zayin, the Rambam starts the halacha talking about Ein oisin madreges lamizbeach, we don't make steps. Shenemer v'lo yisale b'maylis al mizbechi, we make a ramp. V'oile b'maylis al mizbeach loike, if somebody does climb up the mizbeach on stairs, they get malchus. And then in the end of the halacha, he says like this: V'chein hanoiseitz even achas min hamizbeach. If somebody smashes even one stone from the mizbeach, oy mikol ha'heichel, oy mi bein ha'ulam v'la mizbeach, or between the ulam and the mizbeach, derech hashchasa, loike, same halacha. If you break this, you're loike, you get malchus, shenema v'nitatztem is mizbachosam, lo sasun kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. You should not do this to Hashem Elokeichem. So the same halacha. However, the Kesef Mishnah points out that the Rambam here deviates slightly from what he said earlier in Hilchis Yesodei HaTorah. Because in Hilchis Yesodei HaTorah that we mentioned before, the Rambam says there, Hasoiser afilu even achas derech hashchasa min hamizbeach, oy min ha'heichel, oy mishar ha'azara. There the Rambam said, if you're soiser, even one even, from anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash, even from the Azara, you get malchus. But here the Rambam only mentions hanoiseitz even achas min hamizbeach, mentions the mizbeach, the heichel, or bein ha'ulam v'la mizbeach. He doesn't mention the rest of the Azara. So the Kesef Mishnah says, ein li t'moya. Ein li t'moya rabbeinu shekosav, oy min ha'heichel, oy mi bein ha'ulam v'la mizbeach, the mashma dafka hani aval azoris loy. Even though it seems to be mashma here that it's only the Mizbeach, the Heichel, or Beina Ulam V'la Mizbeach, but not the Azara. But says the Kesef Mishnah, no, only Tamaya. Shesamach al Masha Kosu B'Perek Vov Mi'Yesodei HaTorah Shu Iker Din Zeh. The Rambam here is just being saimach on what he said already in Hilchis Yesodei HaTorah Perek Vov, which is the Iker of this din. And there the Rambam said that this loisase applies even in the rest of the Azara. So therefore here the Rambam doesn't mention all of the specifics, he just mentions it more bekitzur, but he means the same thing. So according to the Kesef Mishnah, the Rambam is basically saying in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah that the loisase applies anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash, even in the Azara, and even in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, where he only seems to be mentioning the Mizbeach, the Heichel, and Beina Ulam V'la Mizbeach, the Rambam really, even in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, holds that it applies anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash, even in the Azaros, and he doesn't mention it because he's being saimach on what he said before. That's what the Kesef Mishnah says. However, the Tzafnas Paneach, the Rogatchover, is not satisfied with this mahalach of the Kesef Mishnah, and he is mechadesh a whole new pshat in the Rambam, a very mechudesh pshat in the Rambam, and that's what we're going to go through right now. So the Rogatchover points out that besides for the difference which the Kesef Mishnah pointed out, that in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash the Rambam doesn't mention the Azara, there's another difference. And that is that in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the lashon of the Rambam was hasoiser afilu even achas. And in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, the Rambam's lashon is v'chein hanoiseitz. Hanoiseitz means if somebody smashes and breaks. So, says the Tzafnas Paneach, therefore, pretty clear that we're dealing with two different things over here. Hasoiser is one inyan, and hanoiseitz is something else, and these two halachas should not be confused. So what is the difference? So let's explain first the halacha in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash. Here the lashon is hanoiseitz. Hanoiseitz, one who smashes. So the Rogatchover is mechadesh, and it is a mechudesh pshat, that in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash what the Rambam is talking about is a stone which was already dislodged from the heichel or the mizbeach. We're not talking about somebody who comes to the wall of the heichel or to the actual mizbeach and smashes a stone. The stone already fell out. So now we have a stone lying on the floor to the side. The stone came from the mizbeach, came from the heichel, but now it's not there anymore. In his lashon, the stone was already noisha. It already dislodged and fell away. Now, what's the Rambam saying? If a person walks up to this stone and they smash the stone, even though the stone is no longer part of the Mizbeach and the Heichel, it's lying to the side, nevertheless, says the Rambam, Hanoiseitz even achas, if you smash that stone, you still get malchus because you're over on Leisasum Kein Lashem Elekeichem. And that's why he uses the Lashon Hanoiseitz, if you smash the stone, because he wants to be madgish, that we're not dealing with a stone which is still within the Mizbeach, or still within the Heichel. The stone is off to the side, and all you did was smash the stone. Masheikein in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, where he says hasoiser, hasoiser means the stone is still within the Mizbeach, within the Heichel. And you came and you demolished it. You destroyed the wall, you destroyed the Mizbeach by removing a stone or by breaking a stone. There in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah, the stone is still in its proper place in the Mizbeach or in the Heichel. That's the difference between hasoiser and hanoiseitz. And based on that, he explains why in Hilchos Yesodei HaTorah the Rambam mentions the Azara, and in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash he does not mention the Azara. For this reason, it's meduyik. In Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, where we're talking about a stone that was already dislodged, and the stone is lying to the side, then in hachanami, says the Rogatchover, this loisase will only apply to a stone which originated in the Mizbeach, the Heichel, or Beina Ulam V'la Mizbeach. Only a stone which came from one of these three places, will there be a loisase against smashing that stone even after it was dislodged and fell to the side? Masha'enken, if the stone came from the Azara, which is a lesser kedusha, if the stone came from the Azara, then in hachanami. If that stone already fell to the side, already fell out and became dislodged, and now you smash that stone, you're not going to be over. You're not going to be over. The Rambam in Hilchos Beis Hamikdash is meduyek. It's dafke from the Mizbeach, the Heichel, or Bein Ha'ulam V'la Mizbeach. Only from these three places do we say that even after the stone came off, if you go ahead and smash that stone, you're over. Masha'enkin, if the stone came from somewhere else, like from the Azara, if the stone is dislodged and then you smash it, you're not over. But in Hilchos Yisodei HaTorah, as we said, the Rambam's lashon is haseiser. There he's talking about a stone which is still in the wall. The stone is still in its place. So if the stone is still in its place and you demolish it, you're seiser. So then the Rambam says it makes no difference where it is, even if it's in the Azara or anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash. If you demolish something, if you demolish a wall or you break even a stone from anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash, and that stone was within its proper place, then you get malchus for lo yisasen ken Hashem lekechem, no matter where that stone was. So that's how the Rogatchover explains the difference between these two Rambams. What's taka the Havana? What's the Havana? Why should it matter? Why are we mechalik that when the stone was already noisher, when the stone was already dislodged, you're only over on v'nitatztem if it's from the Mizbeach, the Ula, the Heichel, or Bein Ha'ulam V'la Mizbeach. And if the stone is still in its original place, you're over anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash. What's the Havana? So the Rogatchover explains a beautiful thing. That when it comes to the Mizbeach and the Heichel, or Bein Ha'ulam V'la Mizbeach, there, every stone is ma'akiv. If a stone falls out, if a stone is missing, it's an ikuv in the Mizbeach, it's an ikuv in the Heichel, it's an ikuv Bein Ha'ulam V'la Mizbeach. Every stone is ma'akiv. So therefore, the kedusha on every stone, bilshainai, is not just a kedusha klalis. The stones don't just have kedusha because they're part of the klal of the Beis Hamikdash. Rather, each stone has a kedusha pratis. Since every stone is ma'akiv, so every stone has a kedusha pratis. And therefore, even if that stone was noisher, even if that stone came away, and it's no longer part of the klal, no longer within the Mizbeach, it's no longer within the Heichel, it was noisher to the side. So even though it's not part of the klal, but as we said, the stones in the Mizbeach and the Heichel, since each stone is ma'akiv, so each stone has a kedusha pratis. So even if the stone was noisher, the stone still has a kedusha pratis within the stone, and therefore you're over for smashing that stone. Masha'enkein, in the rest of the Beis Hamikdash, where there's less kedusha, like in the Azara, every stone is not ma'akiv. In the Azara, even if a stone is missing, it's not an ikuv. So therefore, the stones only have kedusha, a kedusha klalis. When they're part of the klal of the binyan of the binyan Beis Hamikdash, they have a kedusha klalis as part of the klal. But there's no kedusha pratis on the avonim within the Azara, because the avonim in the Azara are not ma'akiv. And therefore, as long as the stone is within the wall, as long as the stone is part of the binyan, it has kedusha, the kedusha klalis. And therefore, if you're soiser, even in the Azara, you're over. But if a stone from the Azara was noisher, if the stone fell away, since, as we said, there's no kedusha pratis in avonim in the Azara, only a kedusha klalis, and now the stone is out of the wall and it's lying to the side, so there's no more kedusha in the stone. It's because it's no longer part of the klal. It fell out. So now if you break that stone, you're not over. So this is how the Rogatchover explains the difference between the Rambam in Beis Hamikdash and Yisodei HaTorah. It's two different halachas. In Yisodei HaTorah, we're talking about stones that are still within the Beis Hamikdash. They're part of the binyan, and they have a kedusha klalis. And since they have a kedusha klalis, because they're still within the binyan, if you're soiser anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash, you're over and you get malchus. But Hilchos Beis Hamikdash, the Rambam is talking about a whole new halacha. It's talking about a stone that was noisher. And since the stone was noisher, it's no longer part of the binyan, it's no longer part of the klal. Now we have to look if the stone has a kedusha pratis or not. So here the Rambam says, if it's from the Mizbeach or the Heichel, where the stones are ma'akiv and they have a kedusha pratis, you get malchus for breaking that stone even after it was noisher. But if the stone came from the Azara and it was noisher, since there's no kedusha pratis, you don't get malchus for breaking that stone. Now, Pizeh, the Rambam is meduyuk bil shoynoi, and we don't need to say, like the Kesef Mishnah says, that the Rambam basically is not meduyuk, and he's just being soymech on what he said before. Okay, we're going to move on in the Parsha to Perek Yud Gimel, Pasuk Aleph. Eis kol hadavar asher anochi mitzave eschem oisei tishmru lasois loisoi seif olav v'loisigra mimenu. This is the famous lav of Bal Tosif, that we're not allowed to add to the mitzvahs of the Torah. Loisoi seif olav v'loisigra mimenu. So we're going to talk one nekuda in the lav of Bal Tosif, even though Bal Tosif is a massive sugya. Obviously we can't even cover hardly any of it. But one geschmack word that I saw in the Issur of Bal Tosif, I want to share with you. So there's a Tosfos in Masechta Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Ches Amud Beis, and I'm not going to get into the Shaklavataria that Tosfos is talking about, but the Maskana of Tosfos. This is Tosfos Chav Ches Amud Beis Dibra Mas Chilumina. So Tosfos there says like this: V'yesh loymar there's no Bal Tosif if you do the same mitzvah twice. He's going to give examples soon. Like for Birchas Kayanim, if the Kayanim do Birchas Kayanim multiple times for the same tzibur, that's not Bal Tosif. But if the Kayanim add an additional bracha, besides for the Yivarechecha, Yoir, and Yisa, the three psukim, if they add a fourth pasuk, for example, Gagoin Yosef Hashem Aleichem Kochem, Oy Kayatzeba, that is Bal Tosif. Okay, so by Birchas Kayanim, says Tosfos, adding a fourth pasuk on top of Yivarechecha, if the Kayanim do that, they're over Bal Tosif. They're adding a new bracha. But to repeat Birchas Kayanim, the same three psukim, but repeat that multiple times, says Tosfos, there's no Bal Tosif in that. V'chein, himnata lulav kama pa'amim b'yoyim. Another example, if a person does netilas lulav on Sukkos multiple times, it's not Bal Tosif. Why? Because you're just repeating the same mitzvah multiple times, but each time you're doing the mitzvah as it's supposed to be. So repeating the same mitzvah is not Bal Tosif. Likewise, if a person eats on Pesach, the first night you have a chiyuv to eat a Kazaysim of Matza. If a person eats Kazaysim shel Matza, if you eat many Kazaysim, ain't Bal Tosif. It's not Bal Tosif because you're just repeating the same mitzvah multiple times, and that's not Bal Tosif. V'chein, says Tosfos, b'hadis v'arova shebelulav, within the lulav itself, with hadasim and arovas. Afilu noisen kama hadasim ve'kama arovas belulav. Even if you add more hadasim and more arovas than what you're supposed to have, ein ze Bal Tosif. It's not Bal Tosif. Elohim kein moisif min acher. It would only be a Bal Tosif if you added a new min. Besides hadasim, arovas, and a lulav, you added some new type of leaf. But just by repeating the same minim, by adding more hadasim, adding more aravas, you're just repeating the same minim, there's no Bal Tosif. So, that's the Tosfos. Now, just to sharpen the nakuda which we're going to focus on, Tosfos basically brings two different types of examples and he combines them together. He's talking about, the point of Tosfos is to say that if you repeat a mitzvah multiple times, you're not over Bal Tosif. And his examples are, if Kahanim repeat Birchas Kayanim many times, if you take the lulav many times on Sukkos, if you eat many Kazaysim of Matza on Pesach, and then he also puts into that category if you put many Hadasim or many Aravas in the lulav. The Rambam sees that as part of the same thing. It's like you're repeating the same mitzvah multiple times. So in all of these cases, there's no Bal Tosif. There's only Bal Tosif if the Kahanim add a new pasuk to Yivarechecha, a fourth pasuk from somewhere else. Or you add a new min to the daled minim. That's Bal Tosif. That's Tosfos. Now, it seems like the Rambam does not necessarily agree with Tosfos. Because the Rambam in Hilchas Lulav, Perek Zayin, Halacha Zayin, Perek Zayin, Halacha Zayin, says the Rambam, Kama noitel mehen. How many of these minim do you take? And he says, Lulav echad, one lulav, esrog echad, shnei badei arava, 2 aravas, ushloisha badei hadas, and 3 hadasim. Now the Rambam continues, V'imratza lo hoisif bahadas, kedei sheti yagudu gedoyla, moisif v'noye mitzvahu. If a person wants to add hadasim, to make it more beautiful, you're allowed to, and it's considered noye mitzvah. Avol shar haminim, however, everything else, the lulav, or the aravos, or the esrog, ein meisifin al minyanam. You're not allowed to add any more. You can't take 3 aravos, you cannot take 2 lulavim. Right? This is the halacha which we're all familiar with. Ve'ein goyrin mehen, and you also cannot do less. Ve'im hoisif oigara, and if you did add more aravos or more lulavim, so now there's a machlekes as to what's the girsa in the Rambam, but the girsa which we have is pasul. The Kesef Mishnah brings from Reb Avraham ben HaRambam that the Rambam was chayzer, but al kaponim we're going to go with the simple girsa in the Rambam. The simple girsa in the Rambam is that if you add to any of the other minim besides 4 hadasim, pasul. So if I take 2 lulavim or 3 aravas, it's pasul. So the Rambam is arguing with Tosfos. Tosfos, remember, just said, Afilu noisen kama hadasim v'kama aravos belulav ein ze Bal Tosif. And Tosfos saw that as being the same as repeating the same mitzvah many times, like eating many Kazaysim of Matza and Pesach. So adding more aravos, Tosfos saw as being the same thing, and it's fine. But the Rambam says no. The only min which you can add is hadasim, and if you add any of the other minim, if you add more aravos, or you take 2 lulavim, again, according to the simple girsa, it's pasul. So the shaila is, does this mean that the Rambam is arguing on the whole yesod of Tosfos? And if yes, how would the Rambam explain, for example, how nowadays we can eat many Kazaysim of matzah on Pesach? So there's 2 ways to explain the Rambam. This is from the Shiurim of Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik. He has Reshima Shiurim on Masechah Sukkah, and there he wants to explain 2 different biurim in the shita of the Rambam. The first way is the simple way, and that he says is l'chayra the emes, that the Rambam differentiates between doing one mitzvah many times and adding more aravos or more lulavim to your aguda. He says it's not the same. It's not the same. When you repeat the mitzvah multiple times, then in Achanami, the Rambam agrees to Tosfos that there's no Bal Tosif. If the Kohanim say Birchas Kohanim 3 times, that's fine. If you eat many Kazaysim of matzah, that's fine. If you take the Dalan Minim on Sukkot many times, that's fine. Because each time, you're doing the mitzvah as the Torah said, and by repeating the mitzvah again and again, there's no Bal Tosif. The Rambam agrees to Tosfos in that. But the Rambam doesn't see adding an extra arava or adding an extra lulav as being the same thing. That's where Tosfos and the Rambam part ways. Tosfos thought that if you add more aravas or more lulavim, it's the same thing as repeating the mitzvah again and again. Tosfos put them together. It's like eating 3 Kazaysim of matzah on Pesach. But he says, the Rambam says absolutely not. These 2 things are very different. When you add an extra arava or you add an extra lulav to your daled minim, you're not doing the same mitzvah again and again. The mitzvah itself, the tzuras ha-mitzvah, you changed. You changed the tzuras ha-mitzvah. The Torah said, take 2 aravas, take 1 lulav, and you were moisif within the tzuras ha-mitzvah. So that's very different. When you repeat the same mitzvah again and again, but each time the tzuras ha-mitzvah is the same, the Kohanim say, Yivarechecha Yor and Yisa, 4 times, since each time the tzuras ha-mitzvah was the same, so there's no Bal Tosif. All you're doing is doing the mitzvah again. If you eat many Kazaysim of Matza, each time the tzuras ha-mitzvah is the same. You ate a Kazayis of Matza, so by repeating the mitzvah, there's no problem. So that the Rambam agrees to. But if you're mashana the tzuras ha-mitzvah, by adding an extra arava, or adding an extra lulav, says the Rambam to Tosfos, that's not considered repeating the same mitzvah again. Here you're being mashana the tzuras ha-mitzvah. The Torah said, take 1 lulav and 2 aravas, and you're being meisif. Your tzuras ha-mitzvah looks different. Now you have 2 lulavim, and now you have 3 aravas. Can't compare. So that the Rambam says is possible. Being meisif within the tzuras ha-mitzvah, the Rambam says is Bal Tosif. So you cannot add another arava. But repeating the same mitzvah again and again, but each time the tzuras ha-mitzvah is the way the Torah said, the Rambam agrees there's no Bal Tosif. That's one way to explain the Rambam, and again that he says is l'chayra the emes. There wouldn't be a need to continue, but he has a very geschmack vort as a second beer. He says, let's go ahead and say that the Rambam agrees to Tosfos. That there's no difference between repeating the same mitzvah again and again and being moisif another arava. Right, Tosfos put them together. Let's say the Rambam also puts them together. And therefore, if the Rambam says that you cannot add another arava, or you cannot add another lulav, that means the Rambam would say that you can also not repeat the same mitzvah again and again. Because again, Tosfos sees these 2 things as being the same. So let's go ahead and assume that the Rambam agrees with that. The second beer, right? The second beer. So if the Rambam says you cannot add lulavim, or you cannot add aravis, that means the Rambam holds that even repeating the same mitzvah multiple times is Bal Tosif. So the Kohanim cannot do Birchas Kohanim multiple times in the same tzibur. Person cannot take the lulav, netilas lulav, on Sukkot multiple times. Taka not allowed to. It's Bal Tosif. The same way you cannot add an arava or a lulav in your bundle, according to the Rambam, you also cannot do the same mitzvah multiple times. What's going to be shver is the Kazaysim of Matza on Pesach. We all eat more than 1 Kazayis of Matza on Pesach night. So if we're saying that according to the Rambam, you're not allowed to add another lulav because you're not allowed to repeat the same mitzvah again and again, and Tosfos said, you wouldn't be able to eat more than 1 Kazayis of Matza on Pesach. So according to the Rambam, that takets Issur. How can we eat multiple Kazaysim of Matza on Pesach? Multiple Kazaysim of Matza on Pesach, we're repeating the same mitzvah again and again, according to the Rambam, should be Bal Tosif. So how do we explain that? So says Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, a beautiful vort. It's kind of connected to a vort that we said last week in the Shiur about the din of Shiurim. And he says that we're getting this wrong. When we think about a Kazayis of Matzah on Pesach, the nature of the Kazayis is only a din of a Shiur. It's a din of a Shiur. The Torah says you have to eat a Kazayis. So that's the Kazayis, he says, is not something which is Messiah the Chefza. If a person eats 3 Kazaysim of Matzah, why should we say that this is 3 different maisim? You ate 1 Kazayis, then you ate a second Kazayis, then you ate a third Kazayis. So why should we say that this is 3 maisim? Why not say it's 1 maisa? You ate matzah. You ate matzah, and the amount that you ate was 3 Kazaysim. So l'chayra, what you're using to divide 1 maisa from the next is the fact that it's a Kazayis. The Torah said you have to eat a Kazayis. So you want to say that when you finish 1 Kazayis, the fact that you ate a Kazayis, that's Messiah, the first Maisa. And now when you eat more matzah, the second Kazayis is a new Maisa. And the third Kazayis is going to be a third Maisa. You want to use the Shiur of Kazayis to be Messiah each Achila in and of it for itself, and consider the continued eating to be a new Maisa. Says Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, it's not true. The din of Shiurim is not a din in the siyum hachefza. The Torah didn't say that what is the nature of a kazayis, that a kazayis finishes the maisa achila and makes it a maisa mesuyam, and now any further eating becomes a new maisa. Absolutely not. If a person sits down to eat matzah, even if he eats 4 or 5 kazaysim, it's one maisa. There's nothing to be mesayim and separate the first half of the achila from the rest of it. The Torah said you have to eat a kazayis. That's a din in the achila sa'adam. The Torah was mechayiv the gavra to eat a kazayis. The Torah gave a shiur to be mekayim the mitzvah. In the kiyum ha-mitzvah, the person has to eat a kazayis to be yaitz of the mitzvah. But as far as the maisa achila, says the Soloveitchik, in the maisa achila, the fact that you ate multiple kazaysim, the kazayis doesn't have the power to separate this eating into multiple acts of achila. We still look at it as one maisa achila. So therefore he says the whole yesod of Tosfos is actually not true. Tosfos is right that repeating birchas koyanim multiple times is considered repeating a mitzvah, because each birchas koyanim is a maisa mesuyam. When you finish the 3 psukim of Yivarechecha, Yor, and Yisa, you finished birchas koyanim. And if you start birchas koyanim again, it's tatake a new maisa. The previous maisa is over, and now you're starting a new maisa. So now we can declare, is this Bal Tosif? Was it not Bal Tosif? Same thing with Netilas Daled Minim. If you took the Daled Minim once, then you put them down. So the first maisa ended. When you pick up Daled Minim a second time, it's a new maisa. So again, now we could declare, is this Bal Tosif or not? But when it comes to eating multiple Kazaysim of Matza on Pesach, says Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, Tosfos is wrong for bringing this in. Because eating multiple kazaysim of matzah on Pesach is not considered to be multiple maisim. It's still one maisa achila. You're eating matzah. And the fact that you ate the kazayis is not mesayim the first maisa. The kazayis doesn't turn the first achila into an achila mesuyames, and it doesn't separate it from the future achila. The entire time that you eat matzah is one maisa. So you're not repeating the same mitzvah many times. You're engaged in the same maisa mitzvah. You're eating matzah. The Torah said a kazayis. Yeah, good. Kazayis is a dinun achilas agavra. The gavra is mechuyev to eat a kazayis. And if you eat less than the kazayis, you're not yaitz the mitzvah. But as far as the maisa achilas matzah, if a person ate multiple kazaysim, it's still one maisa. It's not like you repeated the same mitzvah many times. You only did one achilas matzah. So B'meila, he says that could be also pshat in the Rambam. Again, the Rambam agrees with Tosfos that, not agrees, the Rambam argues with Tosfos and says you're not allowed to repeat the same mitzvah multiple times. Again, the same way you cannot add a new lulav, a second lulav, and you cannot add a second arava, the Rambam would say you cannot repeat the same mitzvah multiple times. You cannot do birchas koyanim in the same tzibur twice. You cannot do daled minim on sukkos twice in the same days. But it is Bal Tosif. But you could eat multiple kazaysim of matzah on Pesach, because eating multiple kazaysim of matzah on Pesach, says the Rambam, is not like you repeating the mitzvah of achilas matzah again and again. You didn't finish the first achila. The first achila is nimshach. As long as you're eating matzah, it's one long ma'isa achila. Not a repetition of the same mitzvah. And even though it's multiple kazaysim, the kazaysim don't have the power, the shiur of the kazayis doesn't have the power to separate the eating into multiple ma'isa achilos. It's still one ma'isa achila. The kazayis is not mesayim the first achila into an achila mesuyames. And b'meila there's no Bal Tosif. You can eat as many kazaysim as you want, and there's no Bal Tosif because it's all one ma'isa achilas matzah. That's a second way to explain the shit of the Rambam. Okay, let's go through one more inyan. This is in the end of the Parsha, Perek Tesvav, Pasuk Yud Gimel and Yudalid. And this is the Mitzva of Ha'anakah. That when a person has an Eved Ivri, or an Omah Ivriya, and they work for 6 years, then they have to go free. So when you send your Eved Ivri free, there's a Mitzva of Ha'anakah, Hanik Tanik Loi. You should give him many gifts. Give him gifts. You have to do Ha'anakah and give your Eved stuff when he goes. That's the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah. So in the Sefer HaChinוך, on our Parsha, in the end of this is Mitzvah Tov Pei Beis. So the Sefer HaChinוך concludes the mitzvah by saying like this: that Neheges mitzvah zu bizman habayis, this mitzvah only applied bizman habayis. She'ein din eved ivri noyeg ele bizman shayovel noyeg k'moshe kasavti b'masha kodam, because the dinim of eved ivri only apply bizman shayovel noyeg. So therefore nowadays there's no mitzvah of Ha'anakah. Umikol makoim, but concludes the Chinuch, af bizman hazeh yishma chacham v'yosef lekach. She'im sachar echad mibnei Yisrael, that a person should learn a lesson from the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah. A person should learn something. And that is, that if you hire a Yid, you hire a Jew to work for you, v'avdei zman meruba oy afilu muat, and the Jew worked for you, whether it was for zman meruba or zman muat, she'yanik loy b'tseisei me'imoy me'asher berchei Hashem. When that person leaves you, whether you fire him or he leaves by himself, if a Yid worked for you, it's not talking about an Evet, it's only a hired worker, but if you had a Jew that you hired to work for you, when the time comes for him to move on, you should do the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah and give him gifts. That's how the Chinuch concludes the mitzvah. So that Minchas Chinuch, the last shtickle in the Minchas Chinuch on Mitzvah Tov Pei Beis, so the Minchas Chinuch brings this, and he says, Mashakosov Arav Mechaber mitzad Moisrei Hatoiv af bizman hazeh im schorei sheyanik loy. This is the Mechaber, the Chinuch writes, mitzad Musar. Even nowadays, if you hire somebody, you should do Ha'anakah. So the Minchas Chinuch goes on to say that this is not true l'das Rambam. Why? Because the shit of the Rambam is that even bizman Hamikdash, even bizman shehaya hayovel noyeg, you only had to do Ha'anakah for an Eved Ivri shemachruhu beistin. Right, there's two types of Eved Ivri, one that beistin sold and one that's moicher atzma. The shit of the Rambam is there's only a mitzvah of Ha'anakah to an Eved shemachruhu beistin. Only an Evet sold by beistin. But an Evet shemacher es atzmoi, according to the Rambam, even then, bizman hayovel, when the real dinim of Evet Ivri applied, but an Evet shemacher es atzmoi, there's no mitzvah of Ha'anakah. So he says, therefore, that according to the Rambam, it doesn't make sense to say that nowadays, like the Chinuch says, we should learn a lesson from the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah and pay even a hired worker who works for you. Because since we see in the original din of Ha'anakah that it only applies to an Evet Shemachru based in, so we see, basically, says the Minchas Chinuch, that it's Exeres HaKosov. Miyai Deya Me'ezeh Tam. If it was a Milsa B'Taima, if Ha'anakah was a Milsa B'Taima, if it was something which was logical, it would have applied to an Evet Shemachar Es Atzmai and Shemachru based in. Since according to the Rambam it only applies to an Evet Shemachru based in, so you see that it's a Exeres HaKosov, Miyai Deya Me'ezeh Tam, and therefore we cannot learn from there that nowadays we should give Ha'anakah to a paid worker. And the Sefer HaChinuch who says that we should learn, he says, must be that the Sefer HaChinuch argues with the Rambam, and he's of the opinion that the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah applied to all types of avodim, say an Evet Shemachar Es Atzmoi, and an Evet Shemachru based in, and therefore the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah is mitzad Musar HaToiv, and if it's mitzad Musar HaToiv, it's a Milsa B'Taima, it applied even then to all types of avodim Ibrim, then according to the Sefer HaChinuch, we could learn a lesson that even nowadays you should give Ha'anakah to a paid worker. But he concludes by saying, Ach leishchiach sharav mechaber yenoit midas Rambam im loisha perish lahedye. It's a shtickle doichak, because it's unusual for the Chinuch to argue with the Rambam unless he says so clearly. So if the Chinuch believes that you should give Ha'anakah to even an Evet Shemachar Es Atzmoi against the Rambam, he would have said so clearly, which he didn't. But Lidach Gisa, as we said, since the Chinuch believes that we should learn a lesson nowadays to give Ha'anakah even to a paid worker, so the Minchas Chinuch sees that as a raya that according to the Chinuch, the mitzvah applied even to an Evet Shemachar Satzmah. That is what the Minchas Chinuch says. Now, the Rebbe in Lekotei Sichos, Chelek Yud Tes, Sikha on our Parsha, Parshas Merayi, the Rebbe brings this Minchas Chinuch, and the Rebbe wants to fa'emfer the Shaila. The Rebbe wants to say that the Sefer HaChinuch agrees with the Rambam. The Sefer HaChinuch agrees with the Rambam that you only give Ha'anakah to an Eved Shemachru based in. And an Eved Shemachar Es Atzmoi does not get Ha'anakah. The Rambam and the Chinuch both agree. So Oy Bazoi, as the Minchas Chinuch said, how could we take a lesson to nowadays? If it only applied to an Eved Shemachru based in, it seems to be Kazaysim HaKosov. And if it's Kazaysim HaKosov and it's a milsa beloy timer, how can we apply it nowadays? So the Rebbe explains it like this. He says, firstly, this limud, how do we know Takya that it does not apply to an Eved Shemachar Es Atzmai? So the Gemara has a limud. This is the Gemara in you see where the Gemara is. Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Yudalid. Kiddushin Daf Tesvav. So it's a Gemara in Kiddushin Daf Tesvav. So the Gemara there says, the pasuk says, Hanek Tanik Loi, that you should give him Ha'anakah. So on the word Loi, there's a drasha. Loi, v'loi l'moicher es atzmai. Loi v'loi l'moicher es atzmai. So it's a miyut. Hanek Tanik Loi, Loi to the Eved Shemachru based in, you give it v'loi l'moicher es atzmai. So says the Rebbe, we could learn this limud in two efanim. Which one is the chidush and which one makes sense, which one is the chidush? You can learn in two efanim. We can either learn Hanek Tanik Loi, that's what makes sense, that you should give the Eved Shemachru based in Ha'anakah, and then v'loi l'moicher es atzmai, that's a chidush. The Torah is being mechadesh, v'loi l'moicher es atzmai. Or we could learn fakert. Hanek Tanik Loi, the Loi that you give Ha'anakah to an Eved Shemachru based in, that's a chidush. The chidush is in the fact that you give it to an Eved Shemachru based in. And the V'loi l'moicher es atzmai is the milsa b'taima. So we can learn the limud in two different ways. What's going to be the nafkamina? The nafkamina is going to be nowadays precisely the discussion of the Minchas Chinuch. If I learn that the pashtus is Hanek Tanik Loi, give, that's the pashtus. And the chidush is v'loi l'moicher es atzmai, the chidush is that you don't give a moicher es atzmai, that's a chidush. So I say about the chidush, ein lecha bai ela chidushai. Since the pashtus is Hanek Tanik Loi, the pashtus is to give. And the fact that we're mema'it and Eved Shemachar Es Atzmai, that's the chidush. So I can say ein lecha bai ela chidushai. The Torah is only mema'it that very specific case of an Eved Shemachar Es Atzmai. Only an Eved Shemachar Es Atzmai is left out. Everything else which is not mamish b'doime to Eved Shemachar Es Atzmai is included within the pashtus of Hanek Tanik Loi and gets. And therefore a hired worker nowadays should still get Ha'anakah. Because a hired worker nowadays is not an Eved Shemachar Es Atzmai. He's not an Eved. He's just a hired worker. So, Nachamol. The first tzaddik was to say that the pashtus is Hanek Tanik Loi. Hanek Tanik Loi, give Ha'anakah, that's the pashtus. The Torah is mechadesh, the chidush is in the miyut, aval loi l'moicher es atzmai. So since that's a chidush, ve'ein lecha bai ela chidushai, so we're only going to be mamaid mamish that case of moicher es atzmai. Anything else which is not mamish moicher es atzmai, including a hired worker nowadays, gets Ha'anakah. Gets Ha'anakah. That's the shita of the chinuch. That's what the chinuch says. Give Ha'anakah. It's not because the chinuch says that a moicher es atzmai gets Ha'anakah. The Chinuch agrees to the Rambam that a Moicheres Atzmai does not get Ha'anakah. But the Chinuch sees it as the Chidush. When the Torah was Mema'et a Moicheres Atzmai, that was a Chidush. Loi v'loi l'Moicheres Atzmai was a Chidush, ve'ein lecha b'yel Chidushai. So we're only Mema'et that specific case, nothing else. If we have to add a svara to that, we could add a svara, says the Rebbe. And that's based on the Marshal. The Marshal says, why Take is a Moicheres Atzmai not getting Ha'anakah? A Moicheres Atzmai does not get Ha'anakah because he was over on Kili B'nei Yisrael Avadim. By selling himself, he transgressed the inyan of Kili B'nei Yisrael Avadim, v'lo Avadim la'avadim. So therefore it's clear, that only applies mamish to a case of Moicheres Atzmai. Moicheres Atzmai as an Eved, as a punishment for being over on Kili B'nei Yisrael Avadim, doesn't get Ha'anakah. But nowadays, a hired worker, since he's not an Eved, he's just a hired worker, should still get Ha'anakah. He wasn't over on Kili B'nei Yisrael Avadim, so he gets Ha'anakah. That's the first side. The second side, and this is the chayr of the shit of the Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch was understanding that it's the other way around. The Minchas Chinuch was understanding that the chidush is in a hanik tanik loy. That's the chidush. The fact that it's v'loy l'moicheres atzmai, that's the pashtus. The pashtus is nobody gets Ha'anakah. V'loy l'moicheres atzmai, you don't get Ha'anakah. That's the pashtus. When the Torah said hanik tanik loy, that a evet shemachru based in does get Ha'anakah, says the Minchas Chinuch was tining, that's the chidush. The chidush is that you give a evet shemachru based in. As he said, Umi yedei me'izatam. And since that's the chidush is in the hanik tanik loy, in the giving the evet shemachru based in. So therefore, ein lecha b'yel chidushai. So you only give Ha'anakah to an evet shemachru based in. Anybody else does not get Ha'anakah. And therefore, a hired worker nowadays, according to the Minchas Chinuch, the way he saw it, would not get Ha'anakah. Because the chidush is in the hanik tanik loy. In the giving of the Ha'anakah to the evet shemachru based in, that's the chidush. Now, what is this gufa toloyin? These two Eifanim that we said. Whether the chidush is in the hanik tanik loy, like the Minchas Chinuch, or the chidush is like the Sefer HaChinuch says in the v'loy l'moicheres atzmai, that gufa is going to be toloy in the following chakira. How do we understand in general the Mitzva of Ha'anakah? In Achronim, this is the Mishnah Lamelech in the Rambam and Hilchos Avodim is ma'arich about this. How do we understand the gather of Ha'anakah? One way is to understand Ha'anakah as schar pe'ula. The guy worked for you, so as a schar pe'ula, you give Ha'anakah. And the other way is to understand it as a gather of tzedakah. You don't owe him anything, you don't owe him schar pe'ula. It's an inyan of tzedakah. Inyan of tzedakah, of kindness, to give Ha'anakah. And the Achronim have an arichas about this chakira, whether Ha'anakah is mitzad, whether Ha'anakah is a gather of schar pe'ula, or Ha'anakah is a gather of tzedakah. So this is the two Eifanim that we said before. If I see Ha'anakah as an inyan of schar pe'ula, it's like payment, it's like wages, then the chidush is in the hanik tanik loy. The giving of Ha'anakah to the evet shemachru based in, that's a chidush. Why? Because al pi pashtus, there's no reason to give schar pe'ula. You already paid for the eved. When you purchased the eved, you paid. You paid for the service of the eved when you purchased him in the beginning. So since you already paid for the services of the eved by purchasing him in the beginning, if Ha'anakah is a schar pe'ula, there's no reason to give it. Why should you pay again? Schar pe'ula. You already paid to buy him. So if the Torah is mechayiv you in Ha'anakah, al tz'inyan of schar pe'ula, then the chidush is in the hanik tanik loy. The pashtus, what makes sense is the v'loy l'moicheres atzmai. For sure you don't give a moicheres atzmai Ha'anakah. Why should you? Why should you give him schar pe'ula? You pay to buy him. The Torah was mechadesh hanik tanik loy. A chidush that you should give a evet shemachru based in. It's a special chidush. Even though you already paid to buy him, pay him again at the end, beget a schar pe'ula, pay him again. But that's a tremendous chidush. And that again was the mahalach of the Minchas Chinuch. So we cannot apply this nowadays to a hired worker. There's no inyan to give Ha'anakah nowadays. The Torah gave a special chidush for evet shemachru based in, me'eze tam, and it doesn't apply. That's because Ha'anakah is a gather of schar pe'ula. And as schar pe'ula, it's a chidush. But the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam learn the other way. they learn that Ha'anakah is a gather of tzedakah. Since Ha'anakah is a gather of tzedakah, to show gratitude, to show goodwill, the Eved worked for you for so long, show appreciation. So that's something which makes sense. Somebody worked for you and they're about to leave, besides for the fact that you paid them their wages, or in this case, besides for the fact that you paid to buy the Eved, but it makes sense to give an appreciation, to give a gift, a token of appreciation. So they see Ha'anakah as a gather of tzedakah. It's a bonus, a bonus to show appreciation. So b'meila, what's the Parshas? The Parshas is to give. Hanik tanik loy makes sense. Give Ha'anakah. When the Torah was mema'it v'loy l'moicheres atzmoi, that's the chidush. Why should it be mema'it l'moicheres atzmoi? Al pi Parshas, everybody should get Ha'anakah. Everybody deserves to be shown appreciation. So when the Torah was mema'it that the moicher as atzmoi does not get Ha'anakah, ein lecha bay ela chidushay. So we're only mema'it that specific case. Everything else which is not bedaimeh stays included. So nowadays, a hired worker, since he's not mamash a moicher as atzmoi, he should get Ha'anakah, and he does get Ha'anakah. That's the shita of the Chinuch and the Rambam. So there's no need to make a machlekes between the Rambam and the Chinuch, according to the Rebbe. Both the Rambam and the Chinuch agree that a moicher as atzmoi does not get Ha'anakah, like the Rambam clearly says. But still, since they see that as the chidush, because the Parshas is that everybody should get. The miyut against the moicher as atzmoi, that's the chidush. So they say en lecha bay ela chidushay. But nowadays, a hired worker, you should still show appreciation and give Ha'anakah. A further proof that the Rambam sees it as a gather of tzedakah, the Rebbe says, is from where the Rambam brings the Mitzva of Ha'anakah. In Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Mitzva of Ha'anakah appears in the Rambam not together with the Mitzvahs of Avodim. The Mitzva of Ha'anakah appears in the Rambam together with the Mitzvah of tzedakah, following the Mitzvah of tzedakah. So that is a further proof. The fact that the Rambam did not put the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah with the Mitzvahs of Avodim, he put it together with the mitzvahs of tzedakah, shows what we just said, that according to the Rambam, Ha'anakah is a gather of tzedakah. And as a gather of tzedakah, it would have applied, it should and does apply to everybody, besides for the very specific case that the Torah was mema'it, v'loy l'moicheres atzmoi, for whatever reason, maybe because he was over on Kli b'nei Yisrael Avodim, as we said before, but that's the Gzeras HaKosov, that's the chidush. Ve'en lecha bay ela chidushay. But any other case which is not mamish moicheres atzmoi, the Mitzvah of Ha'anakah applies. That's how the Rebbe wants to explain the shita of the Chinuch and the Rambam, and this way there's no need to make a machlekes between the Sefer HaChinuch and the Rambam.